Hello there, my name is Phil Williams and I would like to welcome you to Audio Angling, the podcast site of fishingfilmsandfacts.co.uk. Anyone hearing this podcast who was lucky enough to have fished the English Channel wrecks when offshore wrecking first became popular back in the 1970s will love this particular interview. And for those that didn't, well, listen in anyway and find out just what you missed. Because the quality of the fishing back then, with lots of virgin wrecks loaded to the hilt with good quality fish, just had to be experienced to be believed. The West Country, and Plymouth in particular, was pretty much the focal point of the UK wreck fishing scene at that time. But what a lot of people failed to realise is that many of the wrecks visited, particularly as the angling boats started pushing increasingly further off, were closer to the Channel Islands than they were to the Devon coast. So much so that extended wreck fishing trips, fishing on the way out and on the way back with a stopover at St Peter Port and a day on the banks, became an increasingly popular option. Then it slowly started to dawn on people, myself included, that if you went over to Guernsey itself and based yourself on the island, you could choose between the banks and the wrecks on a daily basis without the time-wasting journeys across. And at the forefront of both the wrecking and the bank fishing scene on the island from way back then, right up to present times, was and still is local skipper Dougal Lane. And he's still fishing, albeit commercially, now in late 2011.
Now I'm fishing with hook and line, and in the pollock season we're fishing with what they call automatic jigging machines, but we're actually using them as robot fishing rods really. We're fishing for pollock with live bait and drifting over the wrecks out in the channel, and we've got the machine set to spin just like you would with a rod. It's a very interesting way to fish. Multiple hooks, of course, not a single hook. The pollock finishes in July or something like that, and then we fish for bass right through till February really, and that's all rod and line. We fish commercially with rod and line, and normally a double hook trace, long flowing trace, and we spin for the bass again, live sandy or bait. And that's going on now. It's just kicked in now. There's some lovely fish turning up now, so we've got a winter bass fishery that we work this time of year.
Now you and I go back a very long time. 30 years in fact, and in fishing terms, at least 3 boats, plus a lot of very good fish for myself and visiting parties from all over Europe. So with Guernsey not the easiest of angling venues to access, you must have been doing something right. But you wasn't always an angling boat skipper. In fact, in the fullest definition, you probably never was. More a case of mixing both sides of the fishing business as and when the need or opportunity arose. So take us back to the beginning. How did fishing become a way of life for you?
Well, I started out diving actually. I was in the building trade and I learnt to dive. And in the winter there was no amateur diving boats, so I started going with the commercial guys that were diving for scallops. And gradually I got into the scallop diving, and then I gave up the working ashore completely, and I was full-time diving for scallops. And when you're diving, you only sort of work half or 2/3 of the day really. You know, you're limited on bottom time and what you can do. So I got a small boat and was working a few pots and nets and things. It was a 21-foot boat actually, and I set it up for trawling in a small way. And one of the local merchant navy skippers built himself a trawler for his spare time, and it cost him more money than he expected. So he realised that he had to put it working, more hours, and he offered me the brand new boat to run. And so I went into trawling, and it was a 10-metre boat, 33-foot boat with 120 horse forward, which was sort of fairly standard then. And we did all right with it in the winter when the trawling was good, but come the summertime, we were sort of stuck for something to do. So we started going out and fishing the wrecks with hand lines originally, and that wasn't very successful, so we were using rod and line. And that would be 79 or 80 or something like that. And then the local anglers, of course, got to hear that we were out there catching all. I mean, there was huge amounts of fish. That there was hundreds of tons of fish on some of the wrecks. That they was stacked up with ling and cod and pollock in the season. But the local anglers heard about it and started wanting to come along on the weekends. And I ended up with more anglers wanting to go than I could handle. So I started putting together charter trips. Really, it wasn't planned. It just happened that way. Well, certainly the main change from those very early days is the ling stock. When I first started, I believe ling was the most common whitefish in the English Channel. Every wreck you went to, you'd do half a ton a day, 3/4 of a ton a day, no problem at all with 8 or 10 anglers. And now you've got a job there's only a handful of wrecks in the channel that have actually got any ling on at all. They're next to nothing. partly because the wrecks have been very heavily netted over the years and ling is very easy to catch, but also because when I first started, most of the trawlers working the channel worked the smooth ground. The trawl gear they had was only good for, the smoother patches in the channel. And the ling generally lived on the rough ground. And gradually over the years, the French in particular have developed gear that will work rougher ground, and they're now towing over just about anything. And the ling stocks have really gone down, The cod and pollock, although seasonal, but they always were seasonal. This year in particular, we had fantastic cod season in the summer. There was some real big cod and plenty of them. And the pollock, the same. I mean, we had pollock first week of February, I think we started this year. And we had as big a pollock there and as many as I've ever seen. So, it's there's a lot more people out there, so perhaps, there's more effort. A lot more private boats, of course. Boats have come down in price. The electronics have come down in price. A lot more people have got more efficient boats than when we first went out there. But those stocks seem to be holding very well, but ling in particular seems to have gone.
Looking at the fishing in a little more detail now, can we start by taking a closer look at the offshore banks?
The banks. Well, what we used to do, particularly when we first started, when we have relatively slow boats, well, they were slow boats, we used to work the banks on the spring tides with the first charter parties and the wrecks on the smaller tides. And when we first started going to Alderney, the south banks of Alderney, which was one of my favourite stamping grounds, if you had half a dozen bass in a day, it was a good day. And if you had one bass per person, if you had 12 anglers, which is what we used to take, if you had 12 bass, if they caught one each, that was fantastic. That was in the local press. So bass were quite a rare item, where flatfish, particularly turbot, they were very common. I mean, we used to do 20 flatties a day, and if there wasn't a 20-pounder in there, it was a rare day, really. But it's gone almost full circle now, where, particularly in the early 90s, the bass increased dramatically, and we were doing 100 bass in a couple of hours with a charter party, and it got to the stage where anglers really didn't want to catch bass. It was too easy. And the flatfish went down, certainly did go down there for a few years, and then that's come up again now. The bass seems to be dropping off a little bit, and they're getting very skittish, hard to find, where the flatfish have increased dramatically. They're not so big, or perhaps they are. Perhaps there was as many big ones as there ever was, but there's so many small flatfish the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, the charter boats are doing 50 or 60 a day regularly on particularly the shoal bank, which is the bank with the smaller flatfish. But the Casquets and Alderney South Banks have been giving very well as well. There's certainly no lack of fish.
Have you noticed any difference in terms of mix or balance then between the turbot and the brill?
Well, no, there's more flatfish than ever. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we've never seen flatfish on the banks like there's been the last couple of years. They've increased dramatically. Even the trawlers, I mean, they've always caught a lot of brill, but very few turbot really, where this year in particular and last year, they're catching as many turbot as they are brill, and that's a lot of fish, a lot of flatfish. The shoal bank, there must be 5,000 or 6,000 flatfish coming off there with the angling fleet in the summer, I'm sure. There's a huge amount of fish coming off there. And the English charter boats come over, of course, and they stay on it all day, every day, so they do take a lot. But it seems to be holding very well. And, you still hear some nice 20, 30-pound turbot being caught, but there's a lot more effort. There's a lot more private boats out there. Everybody and their brothers got a fast 20 or 30 foot or 25 foot or something like that with a big outboard on the back. And electronics, you can buy a navigator now for 200 quid, where when I first started, it was almost the cost of a house a year to rent one. So things have changed in that way.
Now, I know that you don't do too much very close into shore, but just for completeness, how are the inshore stocks also holding up?
There's a couple of charter boats operating locally now that specialise in real short trips, half-day trips or a day trip and then an evening trip. And they've had marvellous fishing. The pollock inshore, particularly this year, the pollock round the reefs inshore within 10 miles of the harbour really, has been very, very good. They've had as much as ever. And lots of species. The black bream, we've had several years now of massive black bream shoals around the island, which start generally in July or August. And this year was no exception. They caught a lot of black bream between Herm and Sark, what we call the Big Russell, which is an area of reef and mixed bottom through there. They had some fantastic fishing through there, and they didn't really have to go any further than that all summer. They had all the fish they wanted for their charter parties, which is marvellous, really.
The logical next question, I suppose, has to be, why is Guernsey faring much better than the rest of the UK? What makes the Channel Islands so special?
I mean, I don't know how the rest of the country is doing it. From the commercial scene, which I'm in contact with quite a few people, they seem to think that a lot of stocks are actually going up. There are so few fishing boats now left in the EU pond, because they've scrapped so many, that the fish stocks seem to be going up quite quickly. Certainly the cod stock in the North Sea, and we've seen a lot more haddock here now. We've never seen haddock in the past, and they seem to be increasing down here. So I don't know how much your way it seems to be dropping off, but I'm not sure about other places. But of course we've always had strong tides round here. We get 10 knots round Alderney there on a big tide, and 6 or 8 knots round here and Sark. And it sort of limits what you can do, really. There's nowhere near the netting round here there is other places, which is a major problem further west in the channel. And, monofilament netting really is very, very efficient. But it's very limited round here because of the tides. You just can't use them. They fill up with weed or roll up or whatever. So there is sort of a natural reserve, really, round the Channel Islands with the tides.
Now, one fish I do remember catching with you, though never in great numbers as the decline had already set in even in those early days, was the red bream. We used to get good numbers of them out from Lew over the Eddystone Reef back in the 1970s, but now you'd be lucky even to see one in a season. So what do you think happened there?
Well, certainly the French took a lot of red bream, and when I was a teenager, you could go out in the evening, and late summer, you could go out anywhere around the island really and catch all the red bream you wanted. 200 in the evening we used to do regularly, and off the shore there was plenty. And I think mid-80s or early 80s, the French developed the technology for mid-water trawling, or the Danes developed it, but the French took it on big time, mid-80s. And they pretty well wiped out the red bream stock locally. They were fishing south of the island, between Guernsey and what they call the Roche d'Ouvre, which is a French reef, French-owned reef. And they pretty well knocked that right down. And they've never really come back. I mean, we see a few red bream now, but we don't see many. At that time, you didn't see many black bream. When I first started on the wrecks, like I say, early 80s there, or late 70s, in August, for instance, you catch 20 or 30 fine big red bream on a wreck and think nothing of it. But if you saw 2 or 3 black bream, you were over the moon. And it's gone full circle. I had some friends over this time last year, and we were catching 100 or 200 black bream a day, just outside the pier heads, basically. And decent black bream, not massive, but 2-pounders, nice fish. So they seem to have dramatically increased the black bream, where the red bream's dropped off. But we have seen, or we are seeing, a lot more tropical bream. We've got raised bream, gilthead bream, white bream, striped bream in all the bays now. We've got the Mediterranean bream, I suppose, are coming north with the warmer waters, all around the island really. Couch's bream in particular, they started about 10 years ago, perhaps a bit more than that. And then last year we had some sort of up to 9 pound in massive ones. When they first arrived they were tiny. So things certainly have changed in that respect. The bream seem to be really increasing dramatically.
Now I hear you've been appointed president of the Guernsey Fishermen's Association, so perhaps you should tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the reason I'm president of it's the Guernsey Professional Fishermen's Association. And as in most places now, there's less professional fishermen than there used to be, and it gets harder and harder to make a living. But it's mainly on the political side, really. When something comes up, whether it's a harbour development or proposed underwater turbines or a wind farm or something like that, the fishermen need representing. When they propose to change the laws, whether it's to stop something or one particular type of fishing, or whether it's to allow a type of fishing, a new type of fishing, we need to have meetings and vote on the subject. Otherwise, what happens is if you don't have some sort of representative body, the politicians just find somebody that agrees with them and use them as an example to say it's fine. So you need some sort of representative body for the profession. Since the introduction of licensing from the EU to us through Britain, the limits around Guernsey and Jersey have been very grey. When the EU was set up, they totally ignored the islands because it was too difficult to sort out. And gradually over the years, Jersey got their 3-mile and then their 12-mile territorial seas. The boundary between bailiwick of Guernsey, which is Sark and Alderney and Guernsey, and the French coast was sorted out. The limits were set. So that stopped the French coming in that side. And then just recently, in the last 2 years, the Bailiwick Fisheries Management Agreement has been signed. So they've then taken that to the UK and negotiated with the UK, and of course devolved countries now have to be involved. And we're now extending our limits, because we've only got to 3 mile limits at the moment. And then between the 3 and the 12 mile, there is no law, there's no limits, there's no quotas or anything between the 3 and the 12 mile. And that's been the case, ever since that system was set up. But hopefully next year that loophole will be closed, and we will be able to license English fishing vessels in that area, or British fishing vessels rather, in that area. The French have historic rights to fish there between the 6 and the 12. And, while this is all this been going on for many, many years, but certainly the last 2 years it's been, increasing dramatically, the amount of effort. I've been involved in that, or the association's been involved, and I've had a lot of meetings with the fisheries departments. So that's basically what I do with that, Phil.
And presumably boats from elsewhere in the EU won't be allowed in.
No, the Dutch, Spanish, Belgians, all those, they have to stay outside the 12 mile. 1963, I think, when it was set up, and it was historic rights, and the French fished in our waters at that time for certain species. And the way the system was set up, they said where they fished, and they fished on the west and the south of the island, and they didn't fish very much at all to the east of the islands, because the ports along the French coast there had small boats, so they didn't come out very far at that time. And they fished for certain species. They asked for crabs and lobsters and crayfish and demersal species, but they said they didn't fish for scallops or queens, or perhaps they didn't say they didn't fish for them, but they didn't say they did fish for them, so that they didn't get them. And then cuttlefish and squid at the time wasn't really thought of as a major catch, so they didn't ask for them, so they can't fish for those in our waters. So they've got historic rights to fish there, but under certain conditions. And under this new regulation, we will have control out to 12 mile. But we won't really have control over the French. They'll have continue with their historic rights to fish there. But recently, they've had a problem with Dutch companies buying up French boats and rigging them up for Danish seining, which is, trawling with ropes on the bottom, long ropes on the bottom. And it's very, very efficient. Where they work, they absolutely clean the ground. And the French trawlers coming behind can't catch anything. So the French have asked us recently to have discussions about limiting what the French can do in our waters, which is the only way it could go ahead. So that will be interesting next year, I think.
There's the evidence then, if ever it were needed, that so far as fisheries go, EU membership isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Well, the deal that's been negotiated, we've actually got no quotas inside 12 mile. We've got such a small fleet, and the way we've always fished is that we fish what turns up in our waters, basically. We don't go very far. Other than the wreck fishing, we only fish, locally around the islands. And because we fish locally around the islands, we don't affect the stocks, if you know what I mean. If we have a load of pollock turn up this year, or a load of bass, or a heap of conger turns up, or whatever, we stay on the same ground and just change our method of fishing. So long term, we don't have any disastrous effect on any particular stock. So the deal that's been agreed is we haven't got quotas in our waters, but we can't increase our fishing fleet. So it's actually a very good deal for us.
Yeah, it sounds it.
Yeah.
Moving away from the commercial pressure and politics now, both of which have the part to play in what's available to anglers and why, my first trip out with you was as a holidaymaker, probably back in the early 1980s. If I remember right, you were operating Aaron back then, which was quite a small wooden boat.
It was, and that's the one that was built for the Merchant Navy skipper. It was locally built, and it was supposed to be, I think, if I remember rightly, the Aaron was supposed to be sort of 28 foot or something like that. And it was built by a local fisherman who built quite a few wooden boats. He was very good at it. And when the keel turned up, the bit of wood was so nice he wouldn't cut it. So it ended up at 30 plus foot. And a typical French design, if you know what I mean, big flared bow on it, nice sturdy machine, like I say, 120 horse, and probably about 7 knots top end, So when we first started, it was, if we went to the more distant wrecks, you had to start very early in the morning to get out there, 6 or 7 hours steaming. But wherever you went, whichever wreck you went to, you filled the boat up, basically. You didn't have to move around very much.
And many of those fish, both at anchor and on the slow drift, were big, good quality ling, which, as you've already said, have now all but gone. Yeah,
okay. Actually, I should carry on with the Aaron, really, because she was built as a trawler, and we were limited on deck space, and we had no fish room on it. And when we first started going out there, we used to put a 20 cubic foot chest freezer, an old one, that didn't run. We were just using it as an insulated container, really. And we used to stick that on the deck and fill it up with ice, and then fill it up with fish as we caught the fish, and take the ice out, and then sort of by, I don't know, midday or 1 o'clock or something like that, you'd be putting the fish in fish boxes on deck and using the last of the ice to ice the fish down. So it wasn't really ideal for the job, but it was a very pleasant way to fish. And like I say, there was so much fish there, really, you didn't need the speed. Once you got there, you had all you wanted. And what was the next one, Phil, sorry?
The quality of the ling back then was fantastic compared to its virtual non-existence these days.
Well, when we first went out there, I mean, Morris's wreck, which certainly at the time was the first one we had off the west coast, which was about 9 miles off the west coast of the island. That was the first one we came to, and that for, I don't know, 20 years, perhaps more, that we fished it. There was all the ling you wanted on it. If you had a party that just wanted to catch ling, and from a charter skipper's point of view, it was very easy. You just went, unless they particularly wanted to catch cod or pollock or conger or something, you just went to a wreck and went down, normally with perks. I mean, particularly in the summer when there was a few cod about, used to fish perks, and always 1 or 2 hooks above a perk as well. And you'd try for cod to start with when you got to a wreck, and pollock as well on the perks. And then to catch the ling, generally speaking, you just stick a bit of mackerel or something on the perk. And like you say, as you just said, there was most of them I would have said were over £20, and there was enough of them over £30 to make it interesting. And we half a ton a day, 3/4 of a ton a day wasn't out the way at all. And now, well, if we get a couple of 100 kilo in a day, fishing with bait on the bottom, or even anchoring up, which is much more efficient than on the drift, which is how we used to fish. Very hard. There's 2 or 3 wrecks we know west of the island, again, almost due west of the island, and they're right in the bottom of the herd deep. They're in 100, 110 metres of water. They've got ling on, but there's very few now. And there's no small ling. The rough ground used to be covered in small ling. If you put pots or a net or a long line or anything anywhere around the island in the deep water on the rough ground, you caught ling everywhere, and now there's very few. So I don't know if it's overfishing or if it's perhaps the increase in the water temperature, which we know is happening. I'm not sure, but certainly there's nowhere near the stock of ling there used to be.
On the subject of anchoring, I remember one trip in particular where we had a go for conger, which we caught plenty of, plus loads of very big ling. We also picked up quite a few nice taupe as well, but of course conditions weren't always favourable for doing that. What then were the main considerations in your mind when coming to either an anchoring or drift fishing decision?
Well, when we first started wreck fishing, I mean, I started with the Aram, which was, a 30-foot trawler. And then I had Midnight Moon, which was 45-foot light trawler, really. It was beautiful charter boat in some respects, loads of deck space. The wheelhouse had room right round it, so you could fish right from the bow to the stern. There was all the space you needed. And it did 8 knots or 8.5 knots, and all the comfort you wanted, and you didn't need the speed because there was plenty of fish. And we drifted all the time with that. I don't think I ever anchored with that boat, or perhaps for ray or something inshore, but never offshore. It just wasn't necessary. You had all the fish you wanted on the drift. And then in 91, I built the Midnight Express, which was a 43-foot Aquastar, and I actually set that one up for anchoring. It had a winch specifically designed and installed for anchoring, and it had a box below deck directly under the winch where the anchor rope went into. So it was very easy to anchor, and we did more and more of it, partly because you had to get, it's much more efficient if you can get the boat in one place for several hours than it is drifting round. But also because people wanted to fish for conger. At that time I was doing a lot of trade with the continent, particularly Dutch and Belgium. And those guys wanted to catch conger. They wanted to catch big conger. Some of it was catch and release, and some of it I landed, but they wanted to catch big fish, and that was the way to do it. And inshore as well, we did quite a lot of anchoring for ray and taupe. We have fantastic taupe stocks around the island, particularly up around Alderney. In the summer there's massive shoals of female taupe, 50, 60, 70 pounders. So, anchoring is the way to catch those as well. So we did more and more of it. And we always used a full coil of rope, which is 220 metres, and 20 metres of chain on the end of that. And then, depending on the bottom, if you're any mud or sand, that sort of bottom, we used a Bruce anchor, because it would go into the bottom instantly, and particularly when you're trying to anchor a wreck, the anchor has to go exactly where you put it. Otherwise, you miss your target, you end up in the wrong place. And if the bottom was stony, we've got one area around here where it's degraded limestone, and what's left is sort of football-sized flints, very difficult to anchor in. And for that, we always used a CQR, quite a heavy 45 kilo or 50 kilo CQR, and that did the job very well. But the CQR wasn't quite so good on the sand or gravel where the Bruce was.
I suppose to a certain extent, with taupe being quite widespread around much of mainland UK, there wouldn't be that much call for them from visitors when there were lots of other clean ground species that would perhaps be more appealing. In particular, I'm thinking here of undulate rays, good blonde rays and small-eyed rays, but obviously there's a lot more to it even than that. So can you fill in a bit more detail about the fishing in terms of species, techniques and timing out over the banks?
Yes, well, inshore fishing with charter fishing in particular has always been drift fishing locally, drifting across the banks for flatfish and bass and pollock and that sort of stuff, gurnards. But as soon as you put an anchor down, you actually change the type of fish you catch on the same ground. You catch ray and you catch taupe, you catch bullhuss, smooth hounds, all that sort of stuff. Over time, really, we anchored up different places. We also tried uptiding, which has to be shallow water. We tried it in deeper water with heavier leads, and it never really G'd. But when we anchored up deep water, if you anchor up right on the top of the banks, which is sort of 20 metres on top of the banks, that sort of area, and in some of the bays around Alderney, you catch nearly all blonde rays, and you have to fish with sand eel bait, really, for blonde rays to get the best of them. But if you go off the side of the banks, it's a lot more interesting. There's a lot more variety, and you can fish a variety of baits. You can fish baits as well as your sand eel baits, and you get undulates, and you get the taupe and smooth hounds and all that sort of stuff. So you can target what you want really by where you anchor and how deep it is and the type of bottom. And we had some very, very interesting fishing for ray, and particularly in the autumn when they come inshore, and you get bad weather. And if you've got a charter party for a week, which was most of my guys used to come over for a week, they want to fish every day. And as a charter skipper, you then have to put your thinking head on, because if it's blowing a gale from one direction, you have to go in the lee of either Guernsey or Herm or Sark, and then because you're limited where you can go, you then have to fish for what you think will be in that area. So you have to get your thinking head on and probably anchor up and fish a variety of baits. I mean, if sometimes we were right up in the bays and we were fishing, worm baits or crab baits and things for wrasse and inshore fish and bream as well in the autumn, the guys get a good day's angling. They have to change their tackle and sort themselves out to use the baits for the fish that are there, but it's an interesting day.
I suppose that being one of the UK's most southerly outposts, you're also going to see what we would term unusual species on a far more regular basis than elsewhere, both on rod and line and commercially too.
We get a huge amount of different types of fish. We get electric rays, we get a lot of stingray here. We used to get white skate with dravels, they're called locally, and they go to sort of 150, 180 pound. And the last one I remember was sort of 10 years ago, and that was about 70 pound. But we never caught one on rod and line. I've seen them on long lines, I've seen them in a trawl. And we get proper monkfish, fiddlefish they call them locally, but the proper monkfish, which is like a sort of anglerfish shaped dogfish basically. But I've never seen one on rod and line. I've seen anglers on rod and line, and most other, sharks. Most seasons we would have several blue sharks and always a few poor beagles, tangled up with fresher sharks a few times, basking sharks. We were anchored up one day and a basking shark swam through the lines, and that was on for about 10 or 15 minutes. 6 or 7 ton. I mean, that was quite amusing. And we've seen tuna going through here once or twice, blue fins and that sort of stuff. But never hooked one, and I know now that there's swordfish in this area. A friend of mine has caught 2 or 3 swordfish just north of Alderney there in the edge of the Herd Deep fishing commercially, but they certainly are there. But I always used to keep a count every year when I was charter fishing. I always used to keep a count, and I had a fish identification book, or several on the boat, but one in particular. And as we caught each species throughout the season, I ticked them off in the book. And I think my best season was 43 or 45 different species. And that's including, the gurnards and the inshore wrasse, the small wrasse, and the sharks and that sort of stuff. But very interesting fishing, really. But I suppose your basic diet throughout the season was about 10 different species, really.
My boat partner Dave Devine, who was one of the pioneers of dinghy wrecking along the Lancashire coast, reckons that you are the best wrecking skipper for anchoring that he has ever been out with. He often cites a trip we did in very lumpy conditions when you appeared to motor out with no searching about, sent the anchor down, tied it off, and bang, there was the wreck on the echo sounder screen. Very impressive, but we all know it's not as simple as that.
Well, of course, when we started wreck fishing, we were fishing with decker navigators, and they did wander a little bit depending on the atmospheric conditions. But we were very lucky here in that, you know how the decker navigator has 3 separate transmitters, a red transmitter, a green transmitter, and a purple transmitter. That's how it comes up on the machine. And our red transmitter the local one was in Jersey. So that was our most accurate. The closer you are to the transmitter, the less atmospheric problems you have. So our red was the most accurate, and luckily enough, off the west coast of the island where we would do most of our wreck fishing, the tide ran up and down the red lanes. So to anchor a wreck, within reason, you could run straight up. If you were anchoring the ebb, which runs to the southwest, you could run up to the northeast away from the wreck, which would be almost straight up the red lane. You had to allow a little bit of east or west depending on the wind, and then you would shoot the anchor. And when I first started, probably it took me a couple of years to get it down to a T. And then by the time you're talking about, which I think was probably Midnight Express, we were on satellite navigators, which were much, much more accurate. And we had a plotter aboard the boat, so you could actually go to the wreck and go to the exact position you wanted to be when you were anchored. So you would be, 25 or 30 yards or 50 yards, depending on the tide, in front of the wreck. And then you would move the cursor on the plotter up tide exactly 1/10 of a mile. And the full coil of rope that we used is perfect at 1/10 of a mile. And preferably about 1.5 knots of tide is ideal. So when you've got all that set up, you then, as you know, I used to flake the anchor chain along the gunnel, and I would motor up, and as I passed the spot that I'd calculated the anchor had to go, my crew would throw the anchor, and I would come hard round on it and motor back towards the wreck. And before that anchor, in 70 or 80 metres of water, before that anchor hit the bottom, my crew would be pulling on the rope so that as the anchor hit the bottom, you were keeping the anchor chain away from the anchor, so that it all shot in a straight line. And then before you got back to the wreck, you would come round again, back on the way you'd come, and the anchor rope would go slack on the surface, and then you would tie it off. And as the boat drifted down and the anchor rope came tight, if you got all the calculations done correctly, you would be 30 yards in front of the wreck, ready to fish. And because our tide turns all day, it runs basically north at high water and south at low water, and it turns anti-clockwise. So when you set up the wreck, depending on the state of tide, or the time of the tide rather, you would set up one end of the wreck. So if you were fishing the ebb, for instance, you would set up on the northwest end of the wreck to start with. Then as the ebb ran, it gradually runs through, starts at almost west and ends up at south. So you would swing the whole length of the wreck gradually over 3 or 4 hours. And if you got it right, you had a nice long time to fish, and plenty of fish coming up.
I remember you once saying to me that you could think and visualise things in decker lanes as an automatic response. Obviously, as you've explained, it also had its drawbacks, and now out of necessity you've switched to GPS. So with your history of successfully working with both, how, in your mind, do the two compare?
How does Decker compare to GPS? Well, I was brought up on Decker. I'm an old man now, relatively speaking, and half my fishing career we worked on Decker navigators, and the channel was laid out in coloured blocks, basically, and numbered blocks. And if someone said to you, I was fishing in the Jays today, you would know that's 12 miles west of the island to 18 miles west of the island, and they would say, J's and B's or J's and C's or whatever it was, and you knew exactly where they were, because you knew that the colour blocks that you were using. and all the wrecks were in numbers. Everybody now from here, all the amateurs included that fish satellite navigators now, they still talk of the I-20. The I-20 is a wreck that we have about 18 miles northwest of the island, just on the edge of the Herd Deep. But it was the I-20 when I first found it on Decker. That was the Decker number, and it's still called the I-20. We've got the J10 and I-4, and then the next one out from the I-4 is called the 30 milers now. It's 30 milers because when you come round the corner of the island on the modern navigator, it's 30 miles to run. So it mixes a bit, but originally, you know, myself and the Plymouth and Dartmouth Brixham charter skippers, we'd talk to each other all the time, and it was always Decker numbers, and you just build up a chart, or, you know, in your head of the whole channel of these blocks of colours and numbers.
Okay, so you've got a set of wreck coordinates and you're homing in on the target. With GPS, actually getting over it is probably the easiest part. The real skill comes when you arrive. What can be done to get the best out of that situation? So what I'd like to do now is put you in exactly that position from a drift fishing point of view.
Well, when we first went out, Phil, with the Decker navigators, some days they were very, very inaccurate, and when I first started we used to shoot an anchor and buoy to see which way the tide was going and to mark one end of the wreck or to start your drift from or whatever. But you soon find that as the tide turns, here in particular, because it turns all day, it would be in your way. You know, you'd be hooking it with the lines, or you'd get a good, if you put it behind the wreck, or at some stage it would end up behind the wreck, and then you'd drift into it with a good fish on or something like that. So it became a problem, and you very quickly learnt that you were better off just working on the numbers. Providing that the atmospheric conditions were good and the Decker was working that particular day, you were better off just calculating the numbers in your head, and that's literally what you did. You constantly calculated two different Decker numbers to get you in the right place. When we changed over to satellite navigators, at the same time, well, the first ones actually gave us Decker numbers, but they gave us accurate Decker numbers, so we had better position fixing. And then we went over to plotters, and I would think most people now have a plotter of some sort, even if it's only a 4-inch screen or 6-inch screen, there is actually a plotter on it. And I mean, I've never worked just on lat and long, if you know what I mean. I'm sure that if I have done, yes, and I say that I have, because when I've looked for wrecks when I've only had lat and long numbers, so I have done the calculations in my head. But most people now, I would think, have a small plotter, and I always go to the wreck, to the numbers, to the latitude and longitude of the wreck, and put a mark. If I haven't been to that wreck before, I go to the position that I've got, and I put a mark, and then I put it on track, which I think even most small plotters have, and then you go round and round those numbers, depending on the tide. You go up and down the tide or across the tide, and hopefully, you know, something comes up on the sounder.
How far upside of a wreck then would you start your drift, and what species, or in what order, would species be expected to show?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, it depends on the depth to some extent. Most of the wreck fishing around here is between 70 and 80 metres. And if you're fishing pollock and ling and cod on the wreck, then you only have to go up far enough to drop down, if you know what I mean. So you want to be on the bottom, comfortably set up 30 yards in front of the wreck. So depending on the depth of water and the speed of the drift, I mean, sometimes we're working in sort of 3.5 knots of tide. And then at that time you have to go up 1/10 of a mile perhaps. But we have got one or two wrecks, and you must have the same, where there is a hole or a reef or something ahead of the wreck or behind the wreck. And that some days the fish is all in that gully or on that bit of reef. The I-20 that I mentioned before, that particular wreck, there's a gully 1/10 of a mile ahead of that one. So on a spring tide, I mean, the reason we found it, on a spring tide you have to go that far up to get down comfortably, particularly with rank amateurs aboard, if you know what I mean, with a charter party. You have to go that far to give them time to get down. And the ones that were down first were getting fish straight away, fine big cod. So we now know that 1/10 of a mile ahead of the wreck, there is a gully that some days actually holds more fish than the wreck. And we've got other wrecks that have got a scour in front, and you have to drop, you know, the best of the fishing is in that scour in front. Sometimes it's on east or west end of the wreck, you know, depend on how hard or soft the bottom is. They're all different, and sometimes the fish is spread out 200 yards behind the wreck. You can drift for a long way and still catch fish. But that's unusual. I can think of one or two wrecks up towards the north of Alderney, towards the middle of the channel, where there was actually a sandbank. It must be 1.5 tenths of a mile in front of the wreck. And as the tide slackens, it's a very good wreck for pollock. The fish will be 10 or 20 metres above the wreck, and as the tide slackens, they just disappear. And they actually go out to this sandbank. There must be sand eels or bait or something on this sandbank, and almost every slack water, the fish all moves off the wreck and goes out to this sandbank, and then as the tide starts to run hard again, they come back to the wreck.
And when pollock are over a wreck, what is it that takes them so high up in the water column? Are either they or the prey riding the pressure wave deflected up by the tide hitting the obstruction?
I don't rightly know. I'm not sure whether the pollock are actually above the wreck, because you don't generally see them thick above the wreck, if you know what I mean, or whether they follow your bait up, because, invariably we all spin for pollock. It's the way they like something to chase. But I mean, I've seen them 60 or 70 turns on your reel handle above the wreck before they'll take your bait. Now, whether that's where the fish is, or whether it's following you up, and as the light level changes, or finally it thinks that's going to get away from me, I'm not sure. I don't honestly know what the answer is, but some days that's where they want to take the bait. And I mean, the robot fishing rods we're using now, the jigger machines we're using now, it's got a constant readout on the side, and it gives you your line length at all times. And if you're catching them at 50 metres or 45 metres or 35 metres of line out, you'll catch them for half an hour at that depth. So whether it's the pressure wave pushing them up, and I mean, some of the wrecks now are since I started fishing them, they're much flatter now than they used to be. They're gradually degrading with the steel rotting away and things. So the pressure wave now is a lot less than it used to be, but the pollock are still high above the wreck. So I'm not convinced it's the pressure wave. But certainly when the tide is running very hard, you can get the fish in front of the wreck, and that's the pressure wave then. It just slows down for 25 yards in front of the wreck. And I know that from diving, it's surprising on a 10-metre wreck how much slack water there is just in front of the wreck, but not above it, but actually in front of it.
Same positioning questions again, but this time for anchoring a wreck, picking out the different species as you go along.
Well, the last point there, it depends entirely on what you're fishing for. I mean, if you're fishing for cod, for instance, you want to be well ahead of the wreck. And then once you get anchored up, you want to be well ahead of the wreck. I don't know. It's a job to know in distance how far it is. I mean, I know when I'm doing it how far I am ahead of the wreck, if you know what I mean. But whether must be 50 yards or 60 yards ahead of the wreck or something like that, I suppose. Because in 70 metres of water, by the time you hit the bottom, you must have 100 metres of line out. And then if you don't get a bite in a few seconds, really, you can lift your lead up and bounce providing there's a little bit of tide, you can bounce your gear back to the wreck. It's much easier to put a lighter lead on and lift your lead and bounce it back to the wreck than it is to put a great big heavy lead because you're too close. So you're always better off too far ahead of the wreck to start with, and you can always lengthen up a little bit of rope rather than anchor too short and be too close to wreck. Because if you're too close to wreck, besides losing a massive gear, there's only really a conger that's right in the wreck, and if you hook them right in the wreck, you can't get them out, or it's very difficult to get them out. So you're better off ahead of the wreck slightly, even for conger, and make the fish come to you. And certainly the ling and cod are ahead of the wreck, and I've had a lot of success perking when the cod are there, perking in front of on anchor in front of the wreck. That's very efficient. You lose very little gear because your perks actually don't go into the wreck. Where drifting, you know yourself how hard it is to keep a perk out of a wreck. But on anchor, it's very efficient, and after, I don't know what it is, 10 or 15 perking motions, then you have to wind back up, halfway up or something like that, and drop down again, so you're back under the boat. And that works well, and same for pollock. This year we were anchored up for cod and conger. We're using cuttlefish heads for bait, which is a very, very effective bait for cod over here late season. And I was fishing for pollock with the machines with a long flowing trace and doing very, very well on anchor. I'm convinced that next year I'm going to do a lot more of it because it's so much more efficient in time, where when you're on the drift, you're actually only in the catch or kill zone for sort of 10% or 15% of your time, and the rest of the time you're either drifting in front of the wreck to get to the position or drifting behind the wreck with your fish coming up. or motoring back up, where on anchor, once you actually get in position, you can continue to pull all the time. So it's a very efficient way to fish. But as for the distance in front of the wreck, it depends entirely on what you're fishing for and the depth of water. But I would say you're always better off fishing, too far in front of the wreck to start with. You can always let some more rope out and drop back to the wreck rather than shorten up. If you shorten up on your anchor rope, bloody anchor jumps very often, and then your anchor's going towards the wreck. The wind, I like to anchor up in about 1.5 or 2 knots of tide, which is quite difficult to fish in, but it's much easier to get the boat in the right position. If there's a little drop of tide, 1.5 or 2 knots of tide, if you're not quite in the right position, you can always move the tying point on the bow. If you move it one side or the other, the boat slides across the tide slightly, and you can use that to get you in position. Where when the tide gets below 1 knot, if there's the slightest breeze, you blow off the wreck very quickly, even though you've allowed a little bit of east or west in your anchor position for the wind. It's as soon as that tide drops below 1 knot, it's a job to hold. And I would normally get to a wreck, and if I was intending anchoring straight away, I would get to a wreck and still do, half a dozen drifts, if there's any breeze at all, to calculate how much the wind is pushing you across the tide, ready for anchoring.
Do you find sometimes, particularly when fishing baits, that if you get slightly ahead of a wreck, especially if it's lying on sand, that species not normally associated with the wreck, such as turbot, rays and taupe, or even sharks, come into the mix along with the conger and ling?
If you're in the exactly the right place for the wreck, to fish the wreck, there are very little other fish there. There is very little other fish there. If you're off the wreck, if you swing off as the tide slackens off, you do, particularly flatfish and things, taupe, sharks, all those sort of fish you mentioned. You get those, but you don't very often get them. If you're in the kill zone, if you're right in the right spot for a wreck, there's only wrecked fish there. I think there's so much fish there, generally speaking, around here, that they keep the other fish off. Over the years, we've had turbot. We used to get a lot of angler fish when we did a lot of perk fishing for cod in May and June. We used to get quite a lot of angler fish, and some very big ones as well, on the perks. But you don't very often get them on a bait. I mean, having seen underwater footage of anglerfish feeding, they snap at something that moves very quickly, but they don't actually take a dead bait. So that probably explains that. But turbot and brill and gurnards, taupe, one wreck in particular, we used to fish taupe in August on the slack water, like the dead tide in August. But the taupe weren't actually on the wreck. They were as the tide eased and you drifted off the wreck, and there was quite a lot of taupe there. And sharks we've had all over the place, we've picked up sharks, particularly poor beagles, following fish up, when you're winching up. And we have caught a few of them, over the years. Some we've actually hooked and fought to a standstill. We had, I don't know what it was, 250 or 280 pound poor beagle once on a conger trace on wire line, which was quite exciting. And by the time we got it aboard, I think everybody on the boat had a go on it. It was in 120 metres of water, and it went to the bottom 4 times, so it was a hell of a fight, big female. It was on multi-strand wire line, and by the time we got it in, when we finally got a gaff in it and got it aboard the boat, the tip roller on the rod was cut in half completely, and there was just the shaft left in the middle. And I had, with the local paper, actually, the local press, I had the crowd from there out one day when I had the midnight moon, the trawler there, and a poor beagle came up alongside the boat, chomping on a ling that had just come to the surface, and I gaffed it as it bit the ling, and sort of said, "Give me a hand here." I looked round, and there wasn't a punter in sight. The bow and the stern of the boat was full of anglers, but I was standing in the middle with this shark in my hand with nobody giving me a hand. They're all gone, and that was 140 pound. But it wasn't actually hooked. It was just swam past the boat, and I stuck the gaff in it.
So there are still plenty of fish out of the mid-channel wrecks. Well, some species anyway. But what are the prospects of finding virgin wrecks loaded with everything like they were when serious wrecking first kicked off? There must still be unlocated wrecks, but would they necessarily have more and better fish than known wrecks in the vicinity?
I think those days are gone, in all honesty. When I first started, we spent a lot of time and effort getting trawl charts mostly. There was a guy in Cherbourg called Jacques Fion, and he had a deal with all the French trawlers in Cherbourg. They used to bring him their charts every year for updating, and he would take the information, the new information, the new hookies they'd found, the new wrecks they'd found and things like that, towing a trawl around the bottom. He would take those onto his database, well, all by hand of course, but on his database, and he would update their charts with all the hookies and wrecks and things that the other fishermen had found from Cherbourg. And when we first started, we actually got a complete set of charts for the whole channel from him. And we had the Admiralty printout, but the Admiralty printout was terrible, and we paid quite a lot of money for it, and it was very, very inaccurate. The trawl charts from Brixham as well, from the beamers there, they had the wrecks marked on, So there was quite a lot of virgin wrecks at the time. That I-20 that I mentioned before, I had some numbers for that, and I was fishing a wreck about 3 miles away, and I could see a French trawler going round and round in that area. So I thought, he must be fishing the wreck, I'll go over there and fish it with him. And when I got there, I didn't speak to him, but I sort of thought, okay, this is where it is. And I was looking and I couldn't find it. But I found a little gully, and we had 4 or 5 boxes of cod in an hour. And then just as we were finishing up, the Frenchman came alongside me and asked me where the wreck was. So he actually didn't know where it was. But I knew where he'd been fishing and where I'd found the fish. And I said, well, it's just west of me here. And I actually know now I was fishing a gully that the wreck sits across. And I was fishing just off the end of the wreck. And we went back the next day, and he'd found it during the night, and he'd put a flag float on it. I think we took 5 ton of cod off that particular wreck in the first week, and the 2 French trawlers that were working it took 28 ton apiece, I think, of fish. So that's what a virgin wreck was like at that time. But now the channel has been surveyed so many times now by different people. The Admiralty and Chom, I think they're called, from France, they've done a huge amount of surveying the last few years. And they're gradually releasing all the wreck numbers. There was a massive survey, I don't know what it was, 15 or 20 years ago. There was a massive survey north of Alderney there, mostly for cables. But that was it, the whole channel was surveyed. And I can remember Chris Tett from Weymouth, he had a printout from them that he'd paid quite a lot of money for. And it had every wreck from the Casquets across to the English coast in that centre block there above Alderney. So it's all been surveyed. There's not much. But saying that, the last 2 years, I think, I was charter fishing. I found a gully, purely by chance, a very deep gully west of the Casquets there. It was sort of a 20-metre sheer cliff, and I've never, ever seen so much pollock. And that, you go along, it's about 80, 85 metres there, and then suddenly it dropped down to 100 metres, and then came up to 75 metres. The 2 sides of the gully are different heights. And we had an incredible couple of years off there, pollock fishing. I mean, there was tons and tons there. You can go there and just fish all day, every day with angling party. It was marvellous. But since I gave up chartering in about 95, I think I gave up chartering, it was 96, the charter boats hammered that, and now it's not very good at all. Still get a few fish there, but so there are places to find, but not necessarily wrecks.
So far we've been looking specifically at the wreck fishing, but I've probably done as many bank fishing trips with you as I have visits to the wrecks, something the Channel Islands certainly has no shortage of. In fact, I got my personal best bass of 13.2 on one of your trips. So tell us a bit now about the banks and how they've formed.
They're formed by slack water. Basically, nearly all the banks around here are made up of pieces of shell, and it's very light, it's in suspension in the water. And where you have the lee behind the islands, there's Banker North, for instance, is north of Sark. And when the tide is on the flood, which is running north around Sark, there's a massive slack area of water there, area of slack water. And the sand, or shell, falls out of suspension. And then, again, south end of Sark, the Godey, in which you will have fished with me, I'm sure, when you were over here, there's a bank there, a massive bank. Again, that's mostly shell, very, very light gravel. And that's the ebb slack there, and that bank there runs for several miles. It runs almost down to Jersey. In fact, it does run down to Jersey in places. There are bits of bank all the way down there, and it's all caused by the tidal eddies around the islands. We have a bank outside the harbour between Guernsey and Herm. We call it the Great Bank, which is where all our sand eels come from. Now that's slightly different. That's slightly harder. That's more sand than gravel. But there are places on it that are very, very soft. I've dived it quite a lot and done quite a lot of setting trawls up there, diving on top of trawls when they're being towed there. And some of it's quite hard, and then you'll just suddenly have a bank sticks up above the bank, if you know what I mean, a high point, and that's very soft. But again, that's caused by the ebb slack. There's no slack there on the flood, but on the ebb, the way the islands are laid out, there's a massive slack there. And then the shoal bank, which is halfway between Guernsey or a third of the way between Guernsey and the French coast, I think that's caused by the slack water from Alderney and the French coast, because there's nothing immediately around it. And that's a massive area of gravel. And then above that you have the south banks of Alderney. That's caused by the ebb slack and the young flood slack from Alderney. There's a bank above Alderney again, which is caused by the flood slack. Casquets is the same. There's 3 banks at the Casquets that we fish regularly. One of those is very, very hard sand, where the other 2 are normal gravel, and caused by the extension of the reefs west of Alderney right out to the Casquets and Buru, which is halfway between. But again, it's the slack water behind that, and possibly the pressure wave on the flood, and then massive slack on the ebb. And what we didn't realise to some extent when we used to use the Decker system, because we had individual charts for these banks, when you put them on a plotter now and you blow up and you bring up all of the islands on one screen, and you've got all your banks marked, and you can actually see as a strip of gravel runs from northwest of the Casquets right down towards the east coast of Jersey, and there's a strip of gravel runs all the way through there, and the banks. So the whole bottom is gravel, and the banks are the places where it's stacked up with the slack water.
When you drift these banks with the swirls and back eddies, it quickly becomes apparent that there must be features down there affecting the tide. Features which in the different ways are also going to be attractive to fish. So what can you tell us about the geography of a typical bank, and what features attract which fish?
What attracts the fish is the sand eels. When you dive any of these banks, you can barely see the bottom for sand eels. They're almost liquid gravel, particularly the shoal bank. The shoal bank, even as a diver, you can almost swim into the bottom. The whole thing's on the move constantly. And there are millions and millions of sand eels in the summer. And even in the winter there's an awful lot, but a lot more in the summer. And if you scare the sand eel shoal, they just disappear. They just swim straight into this liquid gravel and disappear. And all the banks have got sand eels on. If you get a bank that for some reason one year hasn't got many sand eels on at all, then it's a very poor fishing year on that bank. And we have places, hundreds of places that we fish around reefs and things, and we actually fish a small sandbank in the lee of a reef. But if you have a westerly winter or a northwesterly winter or whatever with the weather, that gravel can disappear from that particular reef for a year or 2. And when that happens, you get no pollock turns up, no flatfish, anything. So it's dependent on the sand eels almost everywhere around here. The top of the bank, all the banks are very, very undulating. Alderney Bank is probably the most undulating. The banks go up and down 10 to 20 metres and very, very steep. When you're on them diving, you can actually slide down them. They're that sheer. If you were skiing, you could ski down them. They're that plumb. And then the top of the shoal, for instance, there's large flat areas, and then there's a crown runs the whole length of the bank, and the western side of that crown drops away 20 metres almost sheer, And then west of that crown, it drops down to 25, 30 metres, and there's fingers, if you know what I mean. The banks, instead of running north-south, which is what the crown runs, the fingers run east-west, and they're still up and down 10 or 15 metres, but they're much slower slopes. There's places of slack water for fish to shelter in all over the banks. Whatever direction the tide is running, there's places for the fish to hide. But fish like bass or pollock and things like that, they tend to go with the tide. We now know, we didn't in the early years, but we do now, that you can pick up a shoal of bass at a certain state of tide at a certain spot where you fish it. And if you're clever with a sounder, you can actually follow that shoal of bass right through the tide. And it'll do the same run every day on a spring tide, for instance. And it'll go fair tide all day. The fish doesn't stop. The fish moves with the tide. And whether that's mackerel or bass or bream or whatever, any shoal fish that doesn't actually get behind, hide behind something, it moves fair tide all day.
And just to tie up any loose ends, what about the other sorts of fish holding features and marks that might hold a few good fish?
I think all features hold fish of some sort, whether it's boulder ground or rough ground or whether it's massive reef. Different species of fish prefer different types of ground. pollock, which is probably our most commonly fished fish around the islands, almost every reef has pollock on. Some of them have lots and lots of pollock, massive shoals of pollock, and they're fished commercially. Some of them only have a few small pollock on, but almost every reef has pollock on, and wrasse, of course. Anything less than 30 metres of water in the summer, there's wrasse everywhere, right up to the tide line. And there's bream in season, and garfish everywhere, where generally in the edges, the garfish generally tend to hang in the edge of the tide, where you have it coming around headlands or reefs and things like that. But every feature, whether it's a sandbank, whether it's a sandy bottom, which is completely different in some respects, or a reef or rough ground, will have its own particular type of fish. And from a charter skipper's point of view, it's very easy to change your type of fishing and fish the different types of fish.
You mentioned back at the beginning that you're currently using automated jigging machines. In some ways, a robotic, non-paying charter party, if you like. But because there is no charter fee to fall back on, you have to catch as many fish as you can. So your tactics, presumably, need to be as good as it gets. What then might rod and line anglers learn from this experience?
Well, it's slightly different, Phil, in that, I have to catch an amount of fish. It's costing us £200 a day in fuel and expenses to be there. So we have to catch quite a lot of fish. So we can't drift round a bank. If you're drifting round a bank for pleasure, and you want to catch a nice big turbot or one or two bass or something like that, we've always worked a long flowing trace dragged on the bottom on the banks with a live sandy or bait, or fishing for turbot, a fillet of garfish, or a fillet of sandy, or fillet of mackerel for that matter. But from a commercial point of view, that's just not enough. If I'm going to go to that bank, I have to go there for the right state of tide and fish for an hour or two when I think it will be most productive. Then I have to move somewhere else. So you have to think a lot more about it when you're commercial. When your day is good, when you leave the harbour with an angling party, it's much easier in some respects. It's harder on the head having to deal with the customers all the time, but it's easier from the fishing point of view. And it's different tactics. We use multi-hooks when we're fishing for pollock, for instance. We use 5 hooks generally on a trace, where if you're fishing for pleasure, you use 1. I generally use, if I'm fishing with a rod, I use 2 hooks on a long flowing trace, although my trace is normally about 7 fathom long. But I use 2 hooks. I think you work more efficiently because you get a chasing effect. You get a small bait on the first hook, a 3 or 4 hook or something like that, with a small sandeel on, and a nice big sandeel on the end hook, for instance, fishing for bass. You get a chasing effect. That bass sees a small fish go past with a big sandeel chasing it, and I think that winds it up. Where if you're there purely for pleasure, a single hook's enough. You don't want to catch 2 fish if that it happens occasionally, but you don't want the work. So there is a slightly different attitude to it, really.
Your other big passion in life outside of fishing is scuba diving. I've seen some first-hand experience of this when I dropped my rod book and reel into the harbour, and you put the wetsuit on to go down and get it. It was like a scene from Excalibur when your arm came up out of the water holding the thing. And I also know that you use these skills in a very unusual way, trawl riding. So explain to us what that's all about.
I've done a lot of diving, as I said earlier on. I came into commercial fishing from diving, really. I started out commercial diving. And I still love to dive. I go away on holiday and dive, But when you set up a trawl, when you put a new trawl on a boat or a new set of doors or you change your system, it can take you a long time to get it set up correctly because you have to make very small adjustments each time to get it right. And everybody thinks or sees a trawl on a video going across the bottom and you think, oh, look at that, that's real brute force and ignorance. But it actually isn't. It's quite a delicate setup to get it catching really efficient. And particularly around here where you're towing these sandbanks, and like I say, some of them are liquid sand. And if your trawl is set up slightly wrong, it just buries in the sand. You can't tow it at all. So it's quite a difficult thing to set up. And what I found was if I dived down on the bank outside the harbour, the Great Bank there, which is only 10 metres on the top, half tide, slack water, I could actually slide down the wire and ride the trawl with my scuba gear on, towing slowly, don't tow too fast, but tow slowly. And I could see how the trawl was set up, and the way a trawl is put together with netting panels. And when it's being towed, you can actually see the seams in the panels. And those seams are supposed to be dead square to where it's being towed and dead plumb if you're looking from the side. and the foot rope, which is the bit that takes the ground, is supposed to be doing certain things so the fish can't escape, pass underneath it or whatever, or digging too hard so you can't tow it. So I could do a month's work really in 5 or 10 minutes, or a month's adjustments in 5 or 10 minutes, just going down and seeing it. It was very interesting, and I've taken some video and stuff as well. It's quite interesting to do.
Is that not a bit dangerous?
It's not very dangerous at all, but you don't go in the trawl. You have to have your mask strapped quite tight, because you don't want your mask blowing off in the current that you're towing into. And I don't know if you know how a regulator works, but a regulator has a diaphragm in it, and the water pressure equalises each side of the diaphragm to give you your air. So if you face the current, so to speak, with this diaphragm, it can actually give you too much air, so you just have to keep the current flowing across it rather than directly against it. But other than that, the trawl, when it's being towed, it's almost like a steel frame, because the water pressure is pressing on all the netting, and it's very, very rigid. And you can actually climb all over it quite easily. And if anything goes wrong, you just leave go, and you swim to the surface. And then we always, whenever we've done it, we've always had a guard boat 100 yards astern, and someone on the lookout just in case you do come up off the trawl. But never had a problem with it at all. And like I say, very, very interesting to see fish on the seabed reacting to a set of trawl doors or a foot rope going along the bottom is very, very interesting. And to see how they react actually as they go into the trawl, you learn a lot very quickly.
And has your diving ever made any contribution to either your charter or your commercial fishing interest? For example, by checking out marks or features?
No, not really. I must admit, I've always fancied doing a video, a fishing video, and some of it was underwater. So the normal fishing video is on the surface, and you show the lines being set up and the bait being prepared and all this sort of stuff, a standard job, fish coming up. But I've always fancied doing the underwater job as well, where you see the bait come down and the fish reacting to it and taking the bait and whatever. I think it would make an interesting video, but I've never really got round to it.
Now I know that this passion for diving has also got you into trouble in the past. I think you know the occasion I'm talking about, so let's hear your take on that story.
Well, when I had the Midnight Express, the Aquastar, I used to always carry my diving gear. Partly if I got a rope in the prop or anything like that, and if I didn't have a charter trip that day, I'd go off and do some diving. And we were up at Alderney one day, and you fish the flood tide, fished very well, and then you have a couple of hours of slack water, which is pretty boring really. Everybody sort of has a kip round the deck whenever waiting for the ebb to start. And I decided that I would go for a dive. Now, my crew at the time was a ex-crabber skipper, so very, very competent crew. He worked for me for 2 or 3 years, and quite capable of taking the boat out, no problem at all. So that there was no danger from that point of view. So I went inshore, on the South Banks there, went quite well inshore, got my diving gear on, and I had a hand spear to sit, for ray or flatties or anything like that. And that was fixed to a line, a rope line that was nice long line, and then a 30-inch float, 30-inch soft float, which normally is big enough to stay on the surface for the boat to follow. If you've got too big a float, it's very difficult to move on the bottom, because the float literally, you're fighting against the float all the time. So I jumped over the side on about the shallowest bit of the South Banks there. It's about halfway up the South Banks. Hit to the bottom, and when I was on the surface, it was still the last of the flood going, so it was running north the tide. But when I got to the bottom, I didn't know, because I didn't have a compass on, but the tide on the bottom was actually already, the ebb was starting, it was running the other way. So what happened was, somewhere up between the bottom and the surface, there was actually a rip, and the tides were running opposite directions. So the float that the boat was supposed to be following disappeared under the surface, because it wasn't big enough to stay up. And the boat lost me, and of course the boat continued to go up with the tide towards the coast of Alderney, or along the coast of Alderney. And I went down with the tide towards the French coast, and I got lost. So Paul, that was skippering the boat, that was on the boat in charge, he put out a mayday, I think it was, and said I was, or called up Alderney Radio and said I was missing. So the lifeboat came out, and air search, and all the boats that were in the area were looking for me as well. And I was drifting away towards the French coast, and everybody was going up the coast the way the surface water was going, because they thought that was the way I'd gone. And I was lost for 2.5 hours.
So what's going through your head at this time?
Well, I was just thinking, look at all these idiots steaming past me, because 3 or 4 boats went right past me, not paying attention, because they were going to the area where they'd been told to look, which was 2 or 3 miles to the north of me. And then we have a search plane here, voluntary search plane called Channel Islands Air Search, and they were flying over me, and they went over me 4 or 5 times, I think, and they didn't see me. And when you're in the water, I'd already dumped my diving gear, my tank and everything, so I was floating higher in the water, and the plane wasn't seeing me. So what I did, I put my flipper, which was, quite a big black piece of rubber, commercial fins, they're quite big. I put it on my hand and I actually waved my flipper. And I'm told, because I know the guys involved, that Air Search had actually finished that particular box, and the navigator, who is not supposed to look out the plane, he's just supposed to navigate, he actually reached into the back of the plane to get another chart, or a chart of the next block or something, and he saw me out the side window of the plane. He actually saw the black flipper. So it was the right thing to do. But it was quite worrying. I thought I was going to go into France for breakfast, really. I was drifting off that way. And by the time they picked me up, I wasn't cold at all. I'd been in the water about 2.5 hours, I think. I wasn't cold, but I was getting very, very tired, because I'd been, every time, a boat had come past, I'd been finning hard to get my upper body out the water. So, I could wave at them, if you know what I mean. And it was quite exhausting. I was getting to the stage where I wasn't going to do a lot of finning to lift my body out of the water. I was just going to drift. And so I was glad to get picked up, but I wasn't particularly worried. But the people on the boat, my clients, which were Dutch, and some of them had been coming with me for many years, they were good friends, and they were very, very upset. They were very worried. But I wasn't. But that night we were supposed to go to a party at one of the fishermen's houses, actually, in a jacuzzi party. And when I got back on the boat, when the lifeboat dropped me back aboard the boat, my crew said to me, what about this party tonight? I said, we're going for sure, because we've got to celebrate that I got picked up. And when I walked out with a drink in my hand and my bathers on to get in this jacuzzi, they had a 120-inch float, with, great big pot float, and a fathom of rope to tie around my ankle so I wouldn't get lost in this jacuzzi.
I'd also suppose the authorities were too happy with you, though, as you were still charter fishing at that stage.
I was, yes, and of course I was in charge of the boat, and Paul actually didn't have a licence to skipper the boat, so I did get in trouble for it. It was quite strange, really, because, the next day I went straight up the harbour office, which was my governing body, and got a severe telling off and sorted it out, and don't do it again, no I won't, and that was it, sorted, really. And over the next 4 or 5 days I had trial by media. The local press got hold of it, and the local television, that sort of stuff, and I ended up with a month's suspension. But it was the last month of my season, or the last fortnight of my season, I think. So I had to employ a licensed skipper to come out with me to be in charge. I mean, I still skippered the boat and put the boat on the fish, but I had to pay someone to come with me and be in charge with a license for the last fortnight. So it was inconvenient, but it was just one of those things, really. If I'd had a bigger float on, it wouldn't have been a problem. And I didn't know that there was a riptide there at that state of tide, but I certainly do now.
And what contribution, if any, did that make to your switch from angling to commercial fishing?
Nothing at all. No. No, the main reason I got out of charter fishing, my son at the time was coming into fishing, and I wanted to work with him, and he didn't like the charter fishing. He was much more interested in trawling, so I bought a small trawler, and we worked together. Fought like cat and dog as it was, but there we are. It was very interesting.
I believe you then had a dabble at pearl trawling.
No, I wasn't. At that stage, I started off with a 10-metre steel trawler. Quite a powerful 10-metre trawler, what they call a rule beater at the time. And we did very well. And we set a beam trawl up, and we were working a patch between Sark and the French coast there, east of Sark, and catching a lot of Dover sole. And then after that, my boy went off and got his own boat, and I carried on with that one. And we started marketing our fish in France. And it was about 50% better prices, landing in France. But the boat really wasn't big enough, so I bought a bigger boat. And then when I had the bigger boat, then I started getting into the pelagic trawling. Single boat to start with, which was towing a trawl off the bottom, a targeted trawling, really. You'd spot a shoal of fish and set the trawl at the height to catch them. And you had an echo sounder on the top of the trawl and sonar on the boat and that sort of stuff. It was very interesting trawling. From that, I went into pair trawling. I went into pair trawling with my son to start with, because it's much more efficient. It's something like 7 times more efficient, I think, pair trawling than single boat trawling, because straight away you haven't got any trawl doors to spread the gear. The boats just stay further apart. And we gradually developed the pair trawling. It was very interesting times.
And what sorts of catches were you picking up?
We set it up originally for catching bream. At the time, there was a massive stock of bream off our west coast in the winter, from January onwards, really, for about 3 months, and a very, very good market in France for black bream. They weren't particularly big. Good fish would be £1 or £2, that sort of size, but the shoal sometimes was sort of 20 metres thick and 10 miles long. It was massive shoals, and we did very well on it. Price wasn't all that great. It was only sort of 50 pence or £1 a kilo or something like that, but we were doing 10 or 20 tons a night between the two boats, so it was big amounts of fish.
Did you ever really get into the bass?
I'd say we caught little bits of bass. We caught half tons and tons of bass, but we weren't targeting them. We bumped into them now and again, but we weren't really targeting them. But later on, there was a huge amount of bass found on our west coast. The anglers found, or commercial fishermen really, found a patch on the west coast there that had hundreds of tons of bass on. And they started fishing with rod and line, and there was some incredible fishing there. Would be, when they find it, 2000 I think they found it, something like that. And where the bass were, they're on massive reefs, so we couldn't go near them with a pelagic trawl. What we found was, at certain states of tide, the tide actually pulled some of the bass off the reefs, and we could take them with the pelagic trawl, and we did have some big catches, yeah, and we had some massive catches.
Any notable individuals amongst them?
No, I don't think we had any big fish. I think 17 or 18 pound was about as big as we actually picked out, but I mean, we caught many tons of them, so we didn't particularly look. I mean, if a fish stood out, we perhaps got it weighed. But I don't think there was there was no monsters. There was nothing, 20 pound, but there was certainly some 17 and 18, and lots of them. But the boats fishing with rod and line, which is how they were fishing it, they were catching the same. They were catching a huge amount of double figure fish. And one of the charter boats was going out there with 3 or 4 guys and doing 20 boxes in 4 or 5 hours. So they were catching a lot of bass. Why
the switch then to the jigging machines?
To run a big trawler like that and to, employ 2 or 3 crew, and there was pair trawling, there's another boat involved in that as well, and the guy I was involved with was very, very hungry, so he wanted to be out there all the time. I was at sea, 6 days a week, 24 hours a day really. When I wasn't at sea, I was in France or England landing my fish. I just didn't get home at all for 3 or 4 years. You get home 1 day a week if you were lucky, and I just got cheese off at it in the end. I was sort of mid-50s and never at home, and so I just had enough. So I said, right, I'm going to sell the trawler and go back to a small boat and enjoy my fishing. I enjoyed the trawling, I really did, but it just got incredibly hard work, and the fuel prices as well going up like they did. We were burning 1,000 litres of fuel a day. It's big expenses.
What you've actually given us so far is an insight into some incredible fishing potential from both the angling and the commercial perspective. Compared to the mainland, it's holding up very well, and for a number of reasons, not the least of which is favourable climate and non-membership of the European Union. But will that strong showing, in your opinion, continue on into the future?
I think it always has. I would have said the best fishing in Europe in some ways. Because of the tides and things, we have very little small fish around here. There's nursery areas that I know of on the English coast for bass and flatfish and all sorts of stuff. But the only nursery areas we have here are right in the bays. Anything outside the bays where the tide is, there's big fish. And there always has been. And, when I was chartering, certainly I would have said it was as good as anywhere in Europe, really. And I think it still is, and I think it'll stay that way. There's so little fishing around here, commercial fishing, really, compared to some places. And the way the tides are, as long as the banks stay there and the sand eels stay there, as long as we don't get wind farms or underwater tidal generators or something that mess it all up, I think it'll carry on indefinitely. I can't see why not. It's in some ways it's better than it's ever been. Fish stocks come and go, and they always have done, I think, long before we were here. And I don't think that will change. No, I think it's very good, Phil.
I actually toyed with the idea of trailing my own boat across some years ago and approached the tourist board with the idea. But with so many reefs and rocks dotted about the place, the harbour master would hear nothing of it. So on that basis, the tourist board couldn't really support the venture. Was he right to put the stops on it, do you think?
No. With modern electronics, it's safe as houses. Yeah, I can't see a problem at all with we've got a massive kayak fleet here now. I think they've taken off everywhere, but they've sold hundreds and hundreds here. They're a problem, They're fine if they're used sensibly in the bays and places like that, but when we see them out between the islands and coming out in the channel and places like that, that's not safe. But there's loads and loads, I don't know how many, but there's a huge amount of people here have 20 footers, 21 footers, 23 footers with big outboards on and things, and they go all over the place. And with modern electronics, I just cannot see a problem.
Yeah, it would have been good, but it wasn't to be. Right, last question now. What is the future for Dougal Lane?
Well, we don't know actually. I mean, if the fuel prices keep going up, I'll have to get out of commercial fishing, I think. Our product, it's food, and the prices of food are controlled by the supermarkets, and the supermarkets push every day to keep the price of food down. And our costs have gone up and up dramatically. You know, our fuel prices, when I first started, fuel was 9p a litre, and now it's 64p a litre I'm paying for it at the moment. So our main cost has gone up dramatically. Everything we buy for the boats is made from hydrocarbons. Every bit of fiberglass, every bit of rope, everything we buy really is oil related, and it's getting incredibly expensive to run these boats. So I'm not sure. I mean, I might have to go back to chartering in all honesty, because that's guaranteed. I shall stay in fishing as long as I can, as long as it stays viable.
Well, the fish are certainly there for you, so in that regard, you'd have no problem getting the bookings.
Yeah, the fish is there. There's no doubt about it, but it's no good catching it unless you get a decent price for it. And our prices haven't kept up with inflation, in all honesty.
I think it's perhaps time I made another approach to the tourist board via the harbour master. The fishing we've just talked about for the past hour or so has certainly re-whetted my appetite. My thanks then to Dougal Lane for giving us such an appetising insight into the waters and the fishing around the Guernsey coast.